You didn't burn out because you were weak. You burned out because the world trained you to believe your worth depends on constant productivity. And the terrifying part, most people never realize they're trapped until they no longer recognize themselves. Every day, modern society quietly pushes you to become more successful, more attractive, more productive, more visible. At first it feels motivating, then it becomes exhausting, and eventually it becomes a prison you carry inside your own mind. By the time most people notice what's happening, they've already turned their entire existence into performance. They wake up tired, scroll endlessly, chase validation, suppress emotions, and call it normal life. But it's not normal. It's psychological conditioning. Byung-Chul Han warned that modern people are no longer controlled through force. They're controlled through self-optimization. In other words, you don't need chains when people willingly destroy themselves trying to become enough. That's why so many people today feel emotionally numb despite being constantly busy. Their bodies are present, but their souls are exhausted. They've mastered achievement while slowly losing connection with themselves. And maybe you've felt this too. That strange emptiness after accomplishing something you once desperately wanted. The guilt when you try to rest. The anxiety of falling behind. The pressure to constantly improve yourself, even when you're already emotionally drained. You keep telling yourself, once I achieve this next thing, then I'll finally feel peace. But peace never arrives because the system was never designed to let you feel enough. In this video, you're going to understand how modern society quietly stole your inner freedom through productivity culture, endless comparison, hyperconnection, and the obsession with achievement. More importantly, you'll discover why burnout is not merely exhaustion, it's a spiritual warning, a signal that your soul is no longer willing to live as a machine. And once you truly understand this, you'll never see your life the same way again. You probably think your exhaustion comes from working too much, but that's not the real reason. The deeper truth is far more unsettling. You've been trained to believe your value depends on constant productivity. Somewhere along the way, you stopped living and started performing. Every morning became a silent audition, every achievement another temporary fix for an emptiness that refuses to stay quiet. And the strangest part? Nobody had to force you into this prison. You walked into it willingly, smiling, calling it ambition, calling it growth, calling it success. That's how modern burnout works. It doesn't arrive like a storm. It sneaks in like a promotion, a self-help podcast. Another late night spent improving yourself. Little by little, the demand for optimization turns your own mind into a machine that never powers down. The world praises you for being busy because busy people rarely stop long enough to ask dangerous questions. Questions like, who am I without performance? Or, what happens if I stop chasing? See, the system loves exhausted people because exhausted people don't rebel. They consume, they scroll, they compare, they keep running on the treadmill of productivity, hoping the next accomplishment will finally bring peace. But peace was never waiting at the finish line. That's the trick nobody tells you. The modern obsession with achievement is like drinking salt water when you're thirsty. The more you consume, the thirstier you become. You hit one milestone, then immediately feel pressure to reach another. New job, better body, more money, more followers, more status. Always more, never enough. And somewhere beneath all that noise, your real self starts fading into the background like an old photograph left in the sun. Byung-Chul Han once described modern society as a system where people exploit themselves voluntarily. And honestly, that might be one of the most terrifying truths ever spoken about modern life. Because when the enemy lives inside your own thoughts, rest starts feeling illegal. You sit down for 5 minutes and suddenly feel guilty. Your body is begging for silence while your mind screams about unfinished goals. Even weekends stop feeling like recovery. They become productive recovery. You meditate to optimize performance. You exercise to become more valuable. You read books not for wisdom but for leverage. Even healing becomes another form of productivity. And listen carefully. There's nothing wrong with growth. The problem begins when your entire identity depends on becoming more. Because if your worth is tied to achievement, failure stops being an event and starts feeling like death. Think about how children laugh before they learn they need to earn approval. A child can spend hours watching ants move across the sidewalk without feeling guilty for wasting time. But adults panic in silence. We've been conditioned to worship efficiency so deeply that stillness feels uncomfortable. That's why so many people can't sit alone in a quiet room anymore. The moment silence appears, buried emotions start rising to the surface. Anxiety, fear, loneliness. The realization that maybe you've spent years building a life that looks impressive from the outside while feeling emotionally bankrupt on the inside. And the scary part is that modern culture rewards this disconnection. The person sacrificing sleep for productivity gets admired. The person constantly available gets praised. The exhausted person becomes the role model. Meanwhile, the soul quietly starves in the corner like a forgotten child waiting to be noticed. Here's where things begin to shift, though. The moment you realize your exhaustion isn't weakness, it's evidence of inner conflict. You start seeing the cage differently. Burnout is often the soul's final protest against a life built entirely around performance. Your body whispers before it screams, first through fatigue, then brain fog, then numbness, then emotional collapse. It's almost poetic in a tragic way. The same system promising freedom slowly steals your ability to feel alive. And yet, most people never notice because they're too distracted chasing the next version of themselves. But eventually, a deeper question begins haunting you in quiet moments. If you spend your whole life becoming more, when do you finally become enough? And that question leads directly into the next trap modern society hides beneath the illusion of achievement. Most people don't realize they're trapped because their prison looks beautiful from the outside. It has polished office buildings, motivational quotes, expensive coffee, and glowing screens filled with productivity hacks. Nobody calls it slavery anymore. They call it success. That's what makes modern burnout so dangerous. It wears the mask of ambition. You wake up believing you're building your future, but little by little, your future starts consuming your present. The promotion costs your peace, the validation costs your identity, and somewhere between deadlines and dopamine hits, you stop asking yourself whether the life you're chasing actually belongs to you. That's the tragedy of modern productivity culture. It teaches you how to perform, but never how to exist. The frightening thing about achievement is how addictive it becomes. The human brain loves rewards, and society knows exactly how to exploit that weakness. Every notification, every compliment, every tiny recognition acts like psychological sugar. For a moment you feel valuable, seen, important, but the feeling never lasts. So you chase the next reward, and then the next, until your entire emotional stability depends on external validation. It's like trying to fill a bottomless hole with trophies. And the worst part? People around you applaud while you destroy yourself. They admire your discipline without seeing the anxiety underneath it. They praise your hustle without noticing you haven't felt genuine peace in years. In a strange way, modern society turned emotional exhaustion into a status symbol. If you're overwhelmed, people assume you must be important. You can see this everywhere once your eyes adjust to it. A person answers emails during dinner because they're afraid of falling behind. Someone checks social media at 2 a.m., comparing their life to strangers who are also secretly miserable. A young man pushes himself past exhaustion at the gym, not because he loves health, but because he believes his body determines his worth. A woman works non-stop trying to prove she deserves respect, while quietly feeling emptier every year. These patterns repeat endlessly because the system feeds on insecurity. If people ever felt truly enough, entire industries would collapse overnight. Think about it. How much of the economy depends on convincing you that you're incomplete? Better clothes, better status, better productivity, better image, better everything. The demand to become more never ends because the system profits from your dissatisfaction. That's why Byung-Chul Han argued that modern people are no longer controlled through punishment, but through endless self-optimization. You don't need chains when people willingly push themselves beyond their limits. And honestly, that realization changes everything, because it means the voice pressuring you every day may not even be yours. It could be years of conditioning disguised as personal ambition. Maybe that guilt you feel while resting was planted there. Maybe your fear of slowing down was carefully manufactured by a culture terrified of stillness. Look closely at your life for a second. How many things do you do because they genuinely nourish your soul? And how many do you do because you're afraid of becoming irrelevant? That question alone can crack open an entire identity crisis. But sometimes identity needs to break before truth can finally enter the room. And here's the strange paradox nobody talks about. The harder you chase worth through achievement, the further you drift from yourself. It's like sprinting toward the horizon, exhausting, endless, impossible to reach. At first, the chase feels empowering, then it becomes survival. Then eventually it becomes emptiness disguised as routine. You start accomplishing goals you once dreamed about, only to feel strangely numb afterward. No joy, no fulfillment, just temporary relief followed by another wave of pressure. That emotional numbness isn't laziness. It's the nervous system collapsing under the weight of endless performance. Your soul was never designed to live like a machine, and eventually the body begins sending signals that something deeper is wrong, not through logic, but through exhaustion, anxiety, insomnia, emotional detachment, symptoms most people try to suppress instead of understand. And that's exactly where the next part of this journey begins. Burnout doesn't happen overnight. It builds slowly, like cracks forming beneath the surface of ice before the entire lake suddenly gives way. At first, you barely notice it. You're just a little tired. Then coffee becomes survival instead of enjoyment. Sleep stops restoring you. Conversations feel heavier. Music doesn't hit the same anymore. Even things you once loved start feeling strangely distant, like colors fading from an old painting. And because modern culture glorifies productivity, you convince yourself this exhaustion is normal. You call it being driven, focused, hungry for success. But deep down, something inside you already knows the truth. Your soul has been running on empty for far too long. Burnout isn't weakness. It's what happens when your inner world has been ignored for so long that the body finally forces you to pay attention. The dangerous thing is that people often misunderstand burnout as a time management problem. So they try fixing it with apps, routines, supplements, or another motivational video telling them to push harder. But spiritual exhaustion can't be solved with better scheduling. Imagine driving a car across a desert with no oil in the engine. It doesn't matter how efficient the route is. Eventually, the machine destroys itself from the inside. That's exactly what happens to people trapped in endless self-optimization. They become highly functional externally while collapsing internally. They smile in meetings while feeling emotionally disconnected. They keep posting online while secretly feeling invisible. They accomplish goals while quietly wondering why none of it feels meaningful anymore. And perhaps the saddest part is this. Many people don't even realize they're spiritually exhausted until they completely lose the ability to feel joy. Byung-Chul Han believed modern society creates depressed and exhausted individuals because it removes space for contemplation, silence, and genuine presence. And honestly, look around. He was right. People are overstimulated but emotionally starving. Every quiet moment gets filled with notifications, scrolling, noise, comparison, endless input. The mind never rests long enough to hear what the soul is trying to say. That's why so many people fear silence now. Silence reveals things distraction was hiding. It reveals loneliness, regret, emotional wounds. The terrifying realization that you may have spent years becoming efficient at a life you don't even truly want. And instead of confronting that pain, most people numb themselves with constant stimulation. More work, more entertainment, more productivity. Anything to avoid sitting alone with themselves for too long, because deep down, they fear what they might discover. You can often recognize spiritual burnout through emotional numbness more than sadness. That's the part nobody prepares you for. You stop reacting to life the way you used to. Good news barely excites you. Rest doesn't restore you. Relationships begin feeling transactional instead of alive. Even your dreams start feeling mechanical, reduced to goals and checklists instead of something deeply meaningful. Some people describe it as feeling like a ghost inside their own existence. Others feel trapped behind invisible glass, watching life happen without truly participating in it. And ironically, many high-achieving people suffer the most because they've trained themselves to ignore their own emotional signals for years. They know how to perform through pain, smile through exhaustion, keep moving while internally falling apart, until one day the body refuses to cooperate anymore. Panic attacks, insomnia, emotional breakdowns, chronic fatigue. The soul always collects its debt eventually. But here's where things become transformative. Burnout can also become an awakening. Sometimes collapse is the first honest conversation you've had with yourself in years. Pain has a brutal way of exposing illusions. It strips away false identities, fake ambitions, empty validation, and forces you to confront the question you've spent years avoiding. What am I actually living for? And strangely enough, that question becomes the doorway to freedom, because once you realize your exhaustion comes from abandoning yourself, you stop seeing healing as merely recovering energy. It becomes something deeper, reclaiming your humanity, relearning how to exist without constantly proving your worth. But before most people can reach that understanding, they must first confront one of the most invisible forces shaping modern suffering: the violence hidden inside positivity itself. One of the most dangerous lies modern culture ever created is the idea that you should always feel positive. Sounds harmless at first, doesn't it? Optimism, motivation, confidence. Those things can absolutely be healthy. But somewhere along the way, positivity stopped being encouragement and became pressure. Now people feel obligated to smile through pain, perform happiness online, and suppress every uncomfortable emotion as if sadness itself were a personal failure. That's why so many people feel emotionally trapped today. They aren't just carrying pain, they're carrying shame for feeling pain at all. Modern society doesn't simply demand productivity anymore. It demands emotional perfection too. Be successful, be attractive, be confident, be grateful, be inspiring. And whatever you do, don't let the world see you breaking. The result? Millions of people silently drowning behind carefully curated versions of themselves. Byung-Chul Han warned that positivity itself can become violent when it leaves no room for human limitation. Think about that for a second. Violence no longer arrives screaming orders or imposing visible force. Sometimes it arrives smiling, holding a motivational quote. You can achieve anything. Your mindset creates your reality. No excuses. On the surface, these phrases sound empowering, but repeated endlessly, they create something toxic: the belief that every failure, every exhaustion, every emotional struggle is entirely your fault. Suddenly, burnout becomes a personal defect instead of a symptom of a broken culture. Depression becomes weakness instead of emotional overload. Rest feels like laziness. Vulnerability feels embarrassing. And because everyone else appears fine online, you start believing you're the only one struggling. That isolation cuts deeper than most people realize. Social media intensified this psychological trap in ways previous generations never experienced. People no longer compare themselves to neighbors or co-workers. They compare themselves to millions of carefully edited lives every single day. Endless success stories, perfect bodies, luxury lifestyles, morning routines that look more like military operations than actual human living. Over time, your nervous system absorbs all of it. Even unconsciously, you begin measuring your worth against impossible standards. And here's the scary part. The algorithm rewards emotional performance. The more polished, confident, and aspirational you appear, the more validation you receive. So people learn to hide exhaustion behind aesthetics. They post productivity while privately collapsing. They upload smiles during depressive episodes. They speak about grinding while secretly feeling emotionally numb. Modern loneliness often isn't the absence of people. It's the absence of authenticity. You can see the emotional consequences everywhere. Someone loses their job and immediately feels worthless because society taught them identity equals productivity. A teenager develops anxiety because they think they must become extraordinary before turning 25. A father feels guilty resting because he believes constant sacrifice defines his value. A woman keeps saying, "I'm fine," so often she forgets what honesty even feels like anymore. Little by little, positivity becomes emotional censorship. Instead of processing pain, people perform resilience. Instead of grieving, they optimize. Instead of asking for help, they consume more motivational content, hoping inspiration will numb the emptiness. But ignored emotions don't disappear. They sink deeper into the body. Anxiety, chronic stress, insomnia, emotional detachment. The soul keeps sending signals until something finally breaks. That's why many people today feel exhausted even when they technically have a good life. Because external comfort cannot replace internal truth. Real healing begins the moment you stop treating your emotions like enemies. Sadness is not always dysfunction. Exhaustion is not always weakness. Sometimes anxiety is your inner self warning you that the life you're living has drifted too far from who you really are. And honestly, there's something deeply liberating about admitting you're human again. Not a machine, not a brand, not a productivity system wearing human skin. Just human, fragile, emotional, limited, alive. Ironically, the people who appear strongest are often those who finally stop pretending to be invincible. Because authenticity reconnects you with something performance never can: inner peace. But the moment you begin removing the mask, another terrifying realization emerges beneath it. Many of the identities people defend so fiercely were never truly theirs to begin with. Most people believe their personality was freely built over time, but if you look closely, much of your identity was shaped long before you were old enough to question it. As a child, you quickly learned which versions of yourself received love, praise, approval, or attention. Maybe you were rewarded for being smart, quiet, successful, helpful, attractive, disciplined, or emotionally strong. And without realizing it, you began adapting. You started editing yourself to survive socially. Little by little, authenticity got replaced by performance. That's why so many adults feel strangely disconnected from themselves later in life. They've spent decades perfecting a character while neglecting the person underneath it. Somewhere beneath all the achievements, responsibilities, and carefully managed images, there's often a quieter question waiting to surface. Who would I be if I stopped trying to earn my worth? Conditioning is powerful, because it becomes invisible over time. Eventually, you stop noticing the mask because you've worn it for so long. The overachiever convinces himself he genuinely enjoys constant pressure. The people-pleaser believes self-sacrifice is love. The emotionally unavailable person calls emotional distance independence. The perfectionist mistakes anxiety for discipline, and modern society reinforces all of it because high-functioning pain is profitable. Think about how many people are praised specifically for ignoring their own needs. The employee who never rests becomes the ideal worker. The parent who burns themselves out becomes selfless. The person who hides emotional struggles becomes strong. But strength without self-awareness eventually turns into emotional imprisonment. A mask may protect you for a while, but over time, it also suffocates you. That's why so many people secretly feel exhausted after social interactions. They aren't being themselves, they're maintaining performances. Byung-Chul Han often explored how modern systems no longer need external control because people internalize expectations so deeply that they police themselves automatically. And honestly, once you see this, you can't unsee it. Notice how often your thoughts revolve around how you appear to others. Productive enough? Attractive enough? Successful enough? Interesting enough? Worthy enough? That endless mental monitoring drains enormous emotional energy. It's like carrying an invisible audience inside your head all day long. Even when alone, many people still feel watched psychologically. That's why true solitude feels uncomfortable at first. Without external validation, the constructed identity begins losing stability. Suddenly, uncomfortable emotions rise to the surface: fear, emptiness, uncertainty. The realization that maybe your entire life has been organized around avoiding rejection instead of pursuing truth. And that realization can shake a person to their core. You can see this conditioning in everyday life more than people realize. Someone chooses a career they hate because it sounds impressive at family gatherings. A young woman edits every photo before posting because she fears not being desirable enough. A man works himself into emotional numbness because vulnerability was treated like weakness growing up. Even relationships become performances sometimes. People say what sounds acceptable instead of what feels real. They suppress needs to avoid conflict. They pretend confidence while quietly battling insecurity. Over time, this emotional fragmentation creates a strange kind of loneliness. The loneliness of never feeling fully seen because nobody is interacting with the authentic you. They're interacting with the version you learn to present. And deep inside, something always knows the difference. The soul recognizes when it's being abandoned, even if the world applauds the performance. The difficult truth is that breaking free from conditioning often feels terrifying before it feels liberating. Because the moment you stop performing for approval, you risk disappointing people who benefited from your mask. Some relationships may change, some identities may collapse. You may even grieve versions of yourself you spent years building. But there's also something profoundly healing about no longer carrying the exhausting burden of pretending. Imagine how much energy returns when you stop constantly managing perceptions. Imagine speaking honestly instead of strategically. Imagine resting without guilt. Imagine existing without turning every moment into proof of worth. That's when life slowly starts feeling real again. But as people begin reconnecting with authenticity, they often encounter another modern crisis waiting beneath the surface. A world so hyper-connected that genuine inner connection has almost disappeared completely. Human beings have never been more connected technologically, yet emotionally. Many people feel abandoned inside their own lives. You can message someone across the planet instantly, scroll through thousands of faces in minutes, and consume endless streams of information without ever truly feeling understood. That's the paradox of modern life. constant connection without genuine presence. The mind stays stimulated, but the soul remains starving, and the scary part is how normal this has become. People wake up and immediately reach for their phones before they even reconnect with themselves. Notifications become the morning soundtrack. The outside world enters your nervous system before your own thoughts even have a chance to breathe. Day after day, your attention gets fragmented into pieces so small that silence itself starts feeling uncomfortable, almost threatening. Byung-Chul Han believed modern society suffers from an excess of positivity and information, where constant stimulation destroys contemplation. And honestly, look at what endless stimulation is doing to people psychologically. Most can no longer sit quietly without reaching for distraction. A few seconds of boredom now feels unbearable because the brain has been conditioned to crave constant input. Scroll, swipe, refresh, repeat. It's almost hypnotic. Social media platforms understand something terrifying about human nature. Attention is one of the most valuable resources on Earth. Entire industries compete to keep your mind occupied because a distracted person is easier to influence, easier to sell to, easier to control. And little by little, many people lose the ability to simply exist in stillness. They become emotionally dependent on noise because silence forces them to confront feelings they've spent years avoiding. What makes hyperconnection so emotionally dangerous is that it creates the illusion of intimacy without the depth of it. You can receive hundreds of likes and still feel profoundly lonely. You can spend all day texting people while secretly feeling invisible. That's because real connection requires presence, vulnerability, and emotional honesty, things modern culture often discourages. Instead, people learn to communicate through curated versions of themselves, carefully selected photos, filtered emotions, performative confidence. Even pain becomes aesthetic sometimes. And over time, relationships start feeling strangely transactional. People network instead of connecting. They consume each other's attention rather than truly seeing one another. The result is a society filled with stimulation but starving for meaning. A generation surrounded by digital voices while internally feeling unheard. You can see the emotional symptoms everywhere once you recognize them. Friends sitting together at dinner while staring at separate screens. Couples physically close, but psychologically miles apart. Children growing up in homes where parents are emotionally absent because work and technology constantly invade their attention. Even moments designed for rest become opportunities for stimulation. Waiting in line, check your phone, riding an elevator, scroll, sitting alone for 30 seconds, fill the silence immediately. Modern life leaves almost no room for reflection anymore, and without reflection, people lose touch with themselves. They stop noticing what genuinely nourishes them. They forget how to listen to their own intuition. Many don't even realize how emotionally overwhelmed they are because distraction numbs awareness. But numbness isn't peace, it's disconnection disguised as comfort. The strange irony is that the more externally connected people become, the more desperately many crave something real. That's why quiet moments suddenly feel emotional when they finally happen. A deep conversation without phones nearby, a walk alone at sunset, reading a meaningful book like The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker or Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl without multitasking every 5 seconds. Sitting in silence long enough to actually hear your own thoughts again. These experiences feel almost revolutionary now because they reconnect you with presence. And presence is dangerous in a world addicted to distraction. Because the moment you truly become present, you begin noticing how much of your life has been shaped unconsciously. You start questioning things you previously accepted automatically, including one of the deepest illusions modern society ever sold humanity, the illusion of freedom itself. Modern people love to believe they're completely free, free to choose, free to speak, free to become whoever they want. And on the surface, it certainly looks that way. Nobody stands over you with visible chains anymore. Nobody forces you into labor camps or openly controls every aspect of your existence. But the most effective systems of control are often the ones you can't immediately see. Byung-Chul Han understood this deeply. He argued that modern power no longer dominates mainly through force, but through internalization. In other words, the system works best when you willingly participate in your own exhaustion. That's why people today often feel trapped without understanding exactly who trapped them. The pressure doesn't come from a dictator shouting orders. It comes from invisible expectations living inside your own mind. Think about how much of your daily life revolves around algorithms, social pressure, performance, and external validation. What you buy, what you desire, what you fear, what you chase, much of it has been subtly shaped by systems designed to influence human behavior. Even your attention is constantly being engineered. Platforms study your emotions, your habits, your impulses, your insecurities. Entire industries are built around predicting what will keep you engaged the longest. And the frightening part is that manipulation works best when it feels voluntary. You believe you're freely scrolling, freely consuming, freely comparing yourself to others. But meanwhile, your nervous system is being conditioned in real time. The modern world doesn't usually force obedience through fear anymore. It creates dependency through stimulation, distraction, and endless psychological pressure to become more. One of the clearest signs of this invisible control is how difficult people find it to truly disconnect. Try leaving your phone untouched for an entire day. For many, anxiety appears almost immediately. A strange restlessness, fear of missing something important, fear of becoming invisible. That reaction reveals something profound. Technology isn't merely a tool anymore. For many people, it has become part of their emotional identity. Silence now feels like absence. Stillness feels unproductive. And because people are constantly connected, they rarely experience genuine psychological separation from society's demands. Work follows them home. Social comparison follows them into bed. Expectations travel in their pockets 24 hours a day. The nervous system never fully exits survival mode. It's difficult to feel free when your mind never truly rests. You can also see this illusion of freedom in how people define success. Most don't actually choose their dreams consciously. They inherit them culturally. Bigger house, more money, better status, perfect body, public recognition. These goals often feel personal, but many were implanted long before people ever questioned them. A man spends 20 years chasing wealth, only to realize he sacrificed his health and relationships along the way. A woman becomes obsessed with perfection because society taught her appearance determines value. Someone works non-stop pursuing a version of success that impresses strangers, but leaves their inner life completely empty. That's the tragedy of unconscious living. You can spend decades climbing a ladder without realizing it was leaning against the wrong wall the entire time. And because everyone around you is climbing too, the madness starts feeling normal. Real freedom begins when you reclaim ownership of your attention, your time, and your inner world. Not because you reject ambition completely, but because you stop allowing external systems to define your worth. Freedom is being able to rest without guilt, to think independently, to disconnect without panic, to exist without constantly performing for approval. And honestly, that level of inner freedom terrifies modern culture because a person who no longer depends on constant validation becomes much harder to manipulate. They consume less compulsively, they compare less obsessively, they begin living intentionally instead of reactively. But once people start breaking free from external expectations, another hidden fear often emerges beneath the surface. the terrifying fear of being ordinary in a world addicted to exceptionalism. One of the quietest anxieties haunting modern people is the fear of being ordinary. Nobody says it out loud, but you can feel it everywhere. In the obsession with visibility, in the desperate need to stand out online, in the pressure to become exceptional before a certain age. Society constantly whispers the same message in different forms. If you are not extraordinary, you are invisible. And invisibility, for many people, feels emotionally unbearable. That's why so many lives become performances designed to prove significance. People don't just want to live anymore, they want to matter publicly. They want evidence that their existence is impressive enough to be acknowledged. But the tragedy is that this endless pursuit of exceptionalism slowly disconnects people from the simple beauty of being alive in the first place. Byung-Chul Han understood that modern achievement culture transforms life into permanent competition. Even personal identity becomes a project constantly needing upgrades. Better image, better career, better body, better lifestyle, better story. And because social media exposes people to millions of others every day, comparison becomes psychologically inescapable. A young artist no longer compares herself to people in her town. She compares herself to the entire internet. A man making honest progress still feels behind because someone younger appears more successful online. Over time, this creates a subtle but devastating emotional effect. Ordinary human existence starts feeling insufficient. Rest becomes laziness. Simplicity becomes failure. Peace becomes mistaken for lack of ambition. People become so addicted to chasing significance that they forget how to appreciate the quiet moments that actually make life meaningful. What's heartbreaking is how many people destroy their mental health trying to escape ordinariness. They overwork themselves, chasing status. They spend money they don't have trying to maintain appearances. They build entire identities around achievement because deep down they fear being forgettable. And honestly, modern culture profits enormously from this insecurity. The more inadequate people feel, the more they consume. Self-improvement becomes endless, not because growth is bad, but because insecurity has become monetized. There's always another course, another aesthetic, another productivity system promising transformation. But here's the uncomfortable truth. No amount of external success can permanently cure internal emptiness. That's why so many celebrities, influencers, and high achievers still struggle with anxiety, depression, addiction, and emotional collapse. Visibility cannot replace inner peace. Applause cannot substitute self-acceptance. You can see the emotional consequences in everyday behavior. Someone feels guilty spending a quiet weekend doing nothing productive. Another person turns every hobby into a side hustle because they believe everything must generate value. A teenager develops panic attacks worrying they haven't made it early enough in life. Even relaxation becomes competitive now. People optimize sleep, track mindfulness, and measure self-care like another achievement system. It sounds absurd when you step back and look at it clearly, but that's how deeply performance culture has entered the human psyche. Many people no longer know how to simply enjoy existence without turning it into evidence of worth. They've forgotten that some of the most meaningful experiences in life are profoundly ordinary. Laughing with someone you love, drinking coffee slowly while rain hits the window, walking without urgency, feeling emotionally present instead of constantly productive. The strange irony is that freedom often begins the moment you stop needing to appear extraordinary. There's something deeply powerful about accepting your humanity without constantly demanding spectacle from yourself. Trees don't compete to prove they deserve sunlight. Oceans don't apologize for being vast and imperfect. Nature exists fully without needing applause. Humans, meanwhile, exhaust themselves trying to become worthy of existence. But the soul doesn't heal through endless comparison. It heals through presence, honesty, and reconnection with what is real. And once a person starts loosening their addiction to external validation, another transformation quietly begins emerging beneath the surface. The rediscovery of silence, the one thing modern society fears most, because silence has the power to reveal everything distraction tried to hide. Modern society fears silence because silence interrupts the system. The moment everything becomes quiet, you begin noticing things distraction was designed to hide. Your exhaustion, your loneliness, your unresolved grief, the fact that maybe you've been running for years without ever asking yourself where you were actually going. That's why the world keeps you overstimulated. Notifications, advertisements, endless entertainment, constant noise, all of it serves the same purpose: to prevent deep reflection. Because a person who truly reflects begins questioning things, and questioning people are difficult to control. Byung-Chul Han believed modern culture destroys contemplation by drowning people in excessive stimulation. And honestly, you can feel that destruction everywhere. Most people aren't addicted to technology itself. They're addicted to escaping themselves. Try sitting alone in complete silence for 30 minutes without touching your phone, music, or distractions. For many people, it feels almost unbearable at first. Thoughts start rushing in, regrets surface, anxiety appears. Memories you buried years ago suddenly return. That discomfort reveals something important. Silence doesn't create emotional chaos. It exposes chaos that was already there. And because modern life rarely gives people space to process their inner world, emotional tension accumulates quietly beneath the surface. The nervous system stays overloaded, the mind becomes noisy, the soul becomes distant. Then one day, people wonder why they feel disconnected from life. But connection cannot exist without presence, and presence requires stillness. You cannot hear your deeper self while constantly drowning in external noise. That's like trying to hear whispers during a hurricane. There's a reason some of history's deepest thinkers valued solitude so intensely. Carl Jung spent enormous amounts of time alone reflecting because he understood something modern culture forgot. The inner world shapes everything. Viktor Frankl found meaning even inside unimaginable suffering because he cultivated inner awareness beyond external chaos. Monks, philosophers, artists, writers, throughout history, silence was never viewed as emptiness. It was viewed as sacred space, a place where truth emerges slowly. But today, many people experience silence almost like withdrawal symptoms because their minds have been conditioned for non-stop stimulation. The brain becomes restless without input. People scroll automatically without even realizing why. Not because the content fulfills them, but because distraction temporarily numbs discomfort. And unfortunately, temporary numbness often becomes a lifestyle. You can see the consequences of this everywhere in modern behavior. People listen to podcasts while showering because they fear being alone with their thoughts. They check notifications during movies, meals, even conversations with loved ones. A quiet walk without headphones now feels unusual to many. Some people haven't experienced genuine mental stillness in years. And slowly, this constant stimulation fragments attention so deeply that people lose the ability to fully experience life. They consume moments instead of inhabiting them. They document experiences instead of feeling them. Even beauty becomes content. A sunset becomes something to post before it becomes something to absorb emotionally. That's why so many people feel strangely empty despite endless stimulation. Their minds are full, but their inner lives are starving. Information increased, wisdom disappeared. But silence changes people in ways productivity never can. Silence reconnects you with instincts buried beneath conditioning. It allows grief to surface, truth to emerge, intuition to breathe again. At first, this can feel uncomfortable because the masks begin falling away. Without distraction, you finally hear your real thoughts instead of society's constant programming. And slowly, something powerful happens. Your nervous system begins remembering what peace actually feels like. Not excitement, not stimulation, peace. The kind that doesn't depend on validation or performance. The kind modern culture quietly teaches people to avoid because peaceful people are harder to manipulate. And once someone reconnects with that inner stillness, they begin understanding something life-changing. Healing doesn't come from becoming more. It begins the moment you stop abandoning yourself. Healing rarely begins with adding more to your life. Most of the time, it begins with refusal. Refusing to keep destroying yourself for approval. Refusing to measure your worth through productivity. Refusing to participate in systems that profit from your exhaustion. That's the strange paradox modern society hides from people. Sometimes growth doesn't look like becoming more. It looks like finally letting go. Byung-Chul Han understood that the modern individual is trapped in endless self-optimization, constantly trying to upgrade themselves like software. But human beings are not machines. Your soul was never designed for non-stop performance. And eventually, the body forces that truth into your awareness through burnout, anxiety, emotional numbness, or complete inner collapse. Pain becomes the language of a self that has been ignored for too long. At first, refusal feels terrifying because your identity may have been built entirely around achievement and external validation. If you stop performing, who are you? If you stop chasing approval, what remains? Those questions can shake people deeply because modern culture taught them to confuse value with output. But healing requires separating your humanity from your performance. A tree doesn't earn its right to exist by growing faster than the forest around it. The ocean doesn't apologize for resting during stillness. Nature never confuses worth with productivity. Humans do. And because of that conditioning, many people feel guilty the moment they slow down. They've internalized the belief that rest must be deserved, that silence must be earned, that peace only comes after enough suffering. But peace was never supposed to be a reward for self-destruction. Real healing often starts with very small rebellions. Turning your phone off for an hour without panic. Eating a meal slowly instead of multitasking through it. Going for a walk without needing to document it online. Saying no without over-explaining yourself. Sleeping without guilt. Reading something nourishing like Meditations by Marcus Aurelius or Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, not to optimize yourself, but to reconnect with deeper truths. These actions sound simple, but psychologically, they challenge the entire logic of modern performance culture. Because every moment you stop treating yourself like a machine, you begin reclaiming parts of your humanity that exhaustion stole from you. And slowly, the nervous system starts softening. Thoughts become clearer. Emotions become more honest. Life begins feeling less like survival and more like presence. What surprises many people is that healing is not always dramatic. Sometimes it feels quiet, subtle, like finally exhaling after holding your breath for years. You start noticing beauty again. Sunlight through a window, genuine laughter, the peace of not needing to impress anyone for a moment. Your relationship with time changes too. Instead of constantly rushing toward the future, you begin inhabiting the present again. And honestly, that may be one of the most radical acts possible in modern society. Presence disrupts systems built on insecurity and endless dissatisfaction, because a person who feels internally whole becomes far less controllable. They consume less compulsively. They compare less obsessively. They stop chasing identities that were never truly theirs. Healing restores something modern culture quietly stripped away from millions of people: the ability to simply exist without feeling inadequate. And maybe that's the deepest truth hidden beneath all of this. You never truly lost control of your life overnight. It was taken gradually through conditioning, distraction, comparison, endless productivity, and the relentless demand to become more. But if control was conditioned into you slowly, freedom can also be reclaimed slowly. One conscious choice at a time, one honest moment at a time, one act of presence at a time. The world will keep telling you to optimize yourself endlessly because exhausted people are easier to influence. But eventually, you reach a point where your soul becomes more important than society's expectations. And in that moment, something changes forever. You stop asking, "How can I become more?" and begin asking a far more powerful question. What would happen if I finally allowed myself to be enough? If this message reached something deep inside you, don't ignore that feeling. Most people spend their entire lives running from themselves, distracting themselves, exhausting themselves, never realizing the peace they were searching for was never waiting in another achievement. It was waiting in reconnection, in presence, in honesty, in finally allowing themselves to exist without constantly proving their worth. Now ask yourself honestly, how much of your life has been built around fear instead of truth? How many dreams are genuinely yours? And how many were inherited from a world obsessed with performance? What would change if you stopped measuring your value through productivity and started measuring it through inner peace? These questions are uncomfortable for a reason. They have the power to change everything. And maybe the most important thing you can do after this video is simple. Slow down long enough to actually hear yourself again. Not society's expectations, not the endless noise online, yourself. Because the moment you reconnect with your inner world, the system begins losing its control over you. If this video resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. I want to know, when was the moment you realized modern life was exhausting your soul instead of nourishing it? Your story might help someone else feel less alone. And if you want to continue exploring psychology, philosophy, emotional freedom, and the hidden patterns shaping modern life, subscribe to Mind's Silent Echo and activate the notifications. There's a reason you found this video today. Your awakening may have already begun.